The paramedic's gloves froze mid-motion as she peeled back the damp crimson-stained bandage. A chill ran down her spine, and the sterile scent of antiseptic was quickly overpowered by something far more primal, something organic and wrong. Her headlamp cast a focused beam onto the wound, expecting necrosis, maybe blackened tissue or exposed bone. What it revealed instead made her stomach lurch. Beneath the thin, almost translucent skin of the old man's leg, something moved. Not pulsing blood, not twitching muscle. No, these were creatures. Dozens, no, hundreds, of tiny white parasites, writhing and coiling like rice grains in boiling water. They squirmed beneath the dermal layer in unnatural patterns, some of them clustering together like threads weaving into muscle, others slithering toward unseen depths within the man's calf. "Oh my God," Jenny Martinez whispered, her voice caught between a gasp and a sob. She stumbled back from the stretcher, nearly knocking over the sharps bin behind her. The beam of her light caught on the tarnished surface of a medal hanging loosely around the patient's neck, a Medal of Honor. Its golden star gleamed against the infected flesh, a cruel contrast to the nightmare unfolding below it. Behind her, her partner, Raoul, dropped their medical kit with a loud clatter. Supplies scattered across the ambulance floor as he instinctively crossed himself, murmuring a Spanish prayer under his breath. Jenny didn't scold him. She wanted to pray too. The man was unconscious, breathing in short, shallow bursts. His face was weathered like a leather map, lined with years of sun and hardship. To most, he looked like any other homeless patient they picked up off the streets. Unwashed, layered in mismatched clothing, the smell of mildew and urine impossible to ignore. But the Medal of Honor made him different. He was once a hero, and now something was eating him alive. Jenny pressed the comm on her radio. Her hands were trembling, her voice cracking. "This is Unit 23. We need immediate trauma intake at Mass General. Elderly male, severe leg infection, possible parasitic involvement, and..." She hesitated, eyeing the medal again. "He's wearing a Medal of Honor." A pause, then a crackled reply. "Copy that. Unit 23. Trauma bay will be prepped." She turned back toward the man, crouching carefully beside him. "Sir," she whispered, gently touching his shoulder through layers of soaked wool. "Can you hear me?" No response. His eyes fluttered briefly, but didn't open. A tremor passed through his leg, and the parasites shifted as if reacting to the contact. Jenny clenched her jaw, forcing herself not to recoil. She'd worked in emergency response for 12 years. She'd seen overdoses, shootings, even a severed hand once, but nothing had prepared her for this. She looked back at Raoul, who was still frozen by the sight. "We have to move," she said, her voice low but firm. "Now," he nodded, snapping out of his trance, and together they lifted the stretcher, wheeling the man out into the rain-slicked street. The city lights reflected on the wet pavement as the ambulance door slammed shut behind them. Inside, the sirens wailed to life. Beneath the whine of the engine and the flickering red lights, Frank Murphy lay unconscious, his body a silent battleground, one that had been fighting a hidden war for decades, invisible to everyone who had once called him a hero. Rain pelted the windshield in rhythmic bursts as the ambulance sped through downtown Boston. Inside, Jenny stared at the old man's leg, wrapped now in temporary gauze and plastic to keep the wound from contaminating the rest of the vehicle. But she couldn't unsee what was beneath. The memory of those parasites squirming under his skin kept replaying in her head, too coordinated to be hallucination, too horrific to be real. Frank Murphy. The name on the weathered military dog tag was barely legible, but the year of birth, 1953, stood out. 72. Jenny clenched her jaw. She'd treated dozens of unhoused patients before, but never one carrying a Medal of Honor. It was the kind of thing they taught you about in grade school: valor, sacrifice, country, but no one ever mentioned what happened after the parade ended. "Vitals?" she asked Raoul, who had finally pulled himself together and was monitoring the machines. Heart rates elevated, fevers climbing, legs starting to swell near the knee, fast. He paused, glancing back at the makeshift bandage. "Whatever's in there, it's not just an infection. That thing's active." Jenny didn't respond. She already knew. She could still see the ripple beneath his skin, like a worm pressing against plastic wrap. Something ancient and alive. The ambulance took a sharp turn and the gurney jolted. Frank groaned, shifting slightly, and Jenny leaned in. His eyes opened halfway, clouded, sunken, barely lucid. "They're marching again," he mumbled, breathless. "Who's marching, Frank?" she asked, brushing damp strands of gray hair from his forehead. "The worms. They drill in formation. Fallujah. I told them not to drink that water." His eyes fluttered shut again, but his lips kept moving, murmuring fragments of a different time, a different battlefield. Jenny felt her chest tighten. This wasn't just illusion. There was something inside him, something he'd carried for years, and nobody had listened. A jolt of guilt hit her. How many like him had she passed by on cold nights, assuming the worst, walking a little faster? How many medals were hidden under layers of Salvation Army sweaters and rain-stained coats? They pulled into the ambulance bay at Massachusetts General Hospital. The trauma team was already waiting. Dr. Robert Chen stood at the center, clipboard in hand, brow furrowed. He was known for his cold efficiency, the kind of surgeon who saw patients as puzzles, not people. But even he paused when Jenny pointed to the Medal of Honor, swinging gently from Frank's chest. "He's not just another trauma case," she said. "You need to see what's under the bandage." The team wheeled Frank through the sliding glass doors as rain streaked down the ambulance windows. Jenny followed, not because it was protocol, her shift had technically ended an hour ago, but because something in her wouldn't let her walk away. Inside Trauma Bay 3, fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead as nurses cut away the makeshift dressings. Dr. Chen's expression remained clinical until the wound was exposed. Then even he recoiled. "What the hell is that?" one of the interns whispered. The skin bulged. Movement rippled in synchronized waves, like a slow tide rolling under flesh. Small, white filaments twisted and retreated as if aware they'd been exposed. The smell hit next, decay laced with something earthy and wrong, like spoiled fruit soaked in blood. "Get infectious disease down here. Now," Dr. Chen barked. "And Page Surgical. We need imaging, a full blood panel, and..." He stopped mid-sentence, finally, acknowledging the medal that hung silently against Frank's chest. For a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes, recognition, perhaps even shame. Jenny stepped closer, her voice low. "He's a Medal of Honor recipient, doctor. He carried 12 men out of a minefield in Iraq, and now, he's carrying this." Dr. Chen didn't reply. He didn't need to. The look on his face said everything. This wasn't just another emergency. This was a reckoning. The rain had become part of him. Frank Murphy sat beneath the Charlestown Bridge, wrapped in layers of wool and nylon that had long surrendered to mildew and street rot. The wind howled through the concrete pillars above like a distant choir of ghosts, rattling the blue tarpaulin he had strung between shopping carts. Every gust made it flap like a broken sail lost at sea. His right leg throbbed beneath a pair of frayed thermal pants. He hadn't bothered to rewrap the wound that morning. There was no point anymore. The last clean bandage he'd had, a torn Red Sox t-shirt, was soaked through within hours. He'd grown used to the cold ooze leaking from the old injury. What he couldn't get used to was the movement. It had started months ago, subtle at first, a twitch here, a flicker there, like a muscle spasm deep beneath the scar tissue. But it wasn't his muscles. Frank knew his body better than most. The war had taught him to read pain like a language. Sharp stabs meant one thing, dull aches another. But this was new. This was alive. The others under the bridge had begun to avoid him. Not because he was dangerous. Frank had never raised a hand in anger since returning home, but because he reeked of sickness, of something unnatural. The worst part was the way they looked at him now, not with pity, but fear. Even Betty, the former nurse who had lost her apartment to cancer bills, had stopped sharing soup with him. Frank didn't blame them. He shifted with a grunt, digging into the plastic bag tucked under his makeshift mattress. Inside was his world, a laminated photo of Sarah, his late wife, her smile. As wide as the day they met, 2 military citations folded so many times the creases had become permanent, and the Medal of Honor still in its velvet case, though the corners were damp and beginning to mold. The medal no longer meant anything. Not out here, not under this bridge, where rats outnumbered people, and the only promise from the government was silence. He had earned it in 2003, carrying Private Tommy Rodriguez through a minefield near Fallujah after an IED blast had torn through their convoy. Rodriguez survived. Frank hadn't come home whole. He'd ignored the pain back then. There had been no time for weakness in a war zone. He'd wrapped his bleeding leg with a field dressing, swallowed 2 Tylenol, and kept moving. No one had noticed. No one ever did. It was only later, when Sarah died while he was on his second tour, that Frank started to feel the weight of everything. He wasn't there to hold her hand, wasn't there to hear her last words. The kids, Michael and Lisa, never forgave him for that. He didn't blame them either. He remembered their faces when he showed up at the funeral in uniform, medals gleaming, eyes hollow. Michael had looked through him. Lisa had cried, but not for him. And after that day, the distance grew like a wound that wouldn't close. Frank shook his head and pulled the sleeping bag tighter around him. His fingers were stiff and cracked, his breath visible in the air. The October cold had arrived early this year. Boston never did wait for anyone. A sharp pain shot up his leg, stopping his breath mid-exhale. He gritted his teeth, stifling the grunt. Then he felt it, distinct and unmistakable. A slow, deliberate crawl beneath his skin. Not a spasm, not a nerve misfire. Something was in him. Something was moving. He looked up toward the concrete ceiling above, blinking against the falling drizzle that crept in through gaps in the tarp. "Guess it's just you and me now," he muttered to the thing inside his leg. And for a moment he swore it moved in response. The walk to the Meridian Street Community Health Center took him nearly 2 hours. Frank leaned heavily on a cracked aluminum cane, its rubber base worn to the metal. Every step sent lightning through his calf, but he kept going. He'd skipped breakfast, again. The small packet of crackers from the shelter was now crushed dust in his coat pocket, and the last cup of coffee he'd had was 2 days old. But today was clinic day. He'd marked it on the inside of his tarp with a piece of charcoal. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and damp wool. Immigrants, young mothers with sick children, and elderly men with sunken cheeks like his waited with numbered slips in their hands. He took a seat near the back, his injured legs stretched stiffly in front of him. A young woman with a toddler stood as far away from him as possible, pretending not to notice the dark stains spreading through the bandage on his calf. They always pretended. When his number was finally called, Frank limped toward exam room 4. The lights buzzed overhead, harsh, fluorescent, sterile. The paper on the examination table crinkled beneath him as he sat, trying not to wince as he lifted his pant leg. Dr. Patricia Williams entered, face buried in a tablet, typing before she even looked up. "Mr. Murphy," she said flatly, "you're back again. How's the leg?" "It's worse," Frank said, his voice raspy. "There's movement under the skin, like something's crawling." Dr. Williams sighed. She didn't hide it. "Mr. Murphy, we've been over this. You have nerve damage from your injury, combined with phantom sensations. These are not uncommon in veterans with PTSD. It's your mind playing tricks." Frank clenched his jaw. "No, I've seen it. They move, at night. They're white, thin like threads." She barely glanced at his leg before pulling the tablet closer. "We've tested for bacterial infection. No signs of parasitic activity. This looks like chronic inflammation, likely compounded by poor hygiene and compromised immunity." Frank's hands trembled. "It's not in my head. I know what I feel. Have you been taking the ibuprofen I prescribed?" He didn't answer. Dr. Williams typed for a few more seconds. "I can offer you a new round of antibiotics. Generic. Should help reduce inflammation." "I don't need pills," he said. "I need someone to believe me." That made her pause. For half a second, her eyes softened. Then the professional mask slid back into place. "I'll also give you a brochure for the VA's group therapy sessions. There's usually a 6-month wait, but sometimes cancellations open up a spot. I strongly suggest exploring the psychological side of this, Mr. Murphy." Frank stood slowly. "You think I'm crazy. I think you're hurting," she said, finally meeting his eyes. "And I think your body and your brain are trying to make sense of that pain." He said nothing more, just pulled his pant leg down, picked up his coat, and limped out of the room. Outside, the sun had begun to set behind the skyline, casting long shadows over the sidewalk. He walked with no destination. The paper bag with the antibiotics felt heavier than it should. At the corner pharmacy, they told him it would cost $47. He stared at the cashier for a moment, then folded the slip and left. $47 was food for the week, or socks, or another tarp. Back under the bridge, he unwrapped his leg again. The smell had worsened. The skin looked bruised, purplish, and beneath the surface, he saw it again. Movement. deliberate, calculated. Frank felt bile rise in his throat as he dropped the bandage. "You were right, Doc," he muttered into the darkness. "I am crazy." Then, after a long pause, he added, "But I'm not wrong." The itching came first. It wasn't the kind that passed with a scratch. It was deep, maddening, like something gnawed at the inside of Frank's leg, with tiny invisible teeth. He tried everything, rubbed it with snow, doused it with rubbing alcohol from a discarded first aid kit, even burned the skin once with a lighter just to feel something different. But nothing worked. The sensation only grew, becoming more sentient with every passing day. The October rain had turned bitter, cold enough to sting the fingers, the kind of cold that got in your bones and refused to leave. But Frank didn't feel it. His body was too busy reacting to the invasion happening beneath his skin. He'd stopped going to the soup line. The others had begun to stare. A man named Curtis, who slept 2 tents over, had pulled Betty aside. A few days earlier, whispering just loud enough for Frank to hear. He talks to himself, and his leg stinks. Like rot. That night, someone slashed the side of Frank's lean-to. He woke to the wind slicing through the hole, his sleeping bag soaked, his food gone. He didn't confront them. He didn't have the strength, or the will. That had started to die too. He spent most nights now watching his leg. He'd prop it under the dim glow of a stolen flashlight, peeling back the layers of whatever he had used to bind it that day. Old shirts, crumpled napkins, even strips of plastic from grocery bags. The skin underneath had taken on a grayish hue. The flesh was soft in places, hard in others, and always, there was motion. One evening, he saw a ripple move from his ankle to his knee. It traveled like a wave under skin, thick and purposeful, not random spasms, not figments of trauma-drenched imagination. This time, he saw it. The thing pushed upward like a periscope, distorting the skin into a grotesque little peak before sliding back down. He had screamed, not a war cry, not a call for help. It was a sound pulled from a primal place, something he hadn't made since the day he held Sarah's hand at the funeral home and begged her to wake up. The next day, he tried to get help, again. He took the bus to Boston Medical Center, borrowing the fare from a charity booth downtown. When he reached the triage desk, the nurse barely looked up. "Do you have insurance, sir?" "No," he said, "but I've got something in my leg. Parasites. I can see them. They're real." He pulled up his pant leg as best he could, exposing the wound to the fluorescent light. The nurse winced. Then came the clipboard, the list of shelters, the pamphlet about hygiene, the quietly summoned security officer who politely asked him to leave. "Come back when it's an emergency," the nurse said as he was ushered out. Frank looked back at her. His voice was quiet. "It is an emergency." That night, back under the bridge, Frank didn't sleep. He didn't try. He stared at his leg until dawn, until the first traces of sun leaked through the cracks in the overpass. And for the first time, he wondered if maybe he wouldn't make it through the winter, not because of the cold, because whatever was inside him had finally decided to finish the job. The storm rolled in fast. By early evening, the sky had turned the color of wet ash. Clouds sagged low over the city, and thunder grumbled like distant artillery. Frank crouched in the shadow of a shuttered bookstore, tucked into a shallow doorway where the wind couldn't reach. His makeshift crutch, a broken mop handle, leaned against the wall beside him. His leg pulsed with heat. Every heartbeat was a hammer, pounding fire through his veins. He didn't remember falling asleep, but when the cold splash of rain reached his face, he awoke with a jolt. Something was wrong. It wasn't just pain now, it was movement. Constant, erratic. His whole calf was twitching, alive in a way no human limb should be. He looked down and slowly unwrapped the soaked layers from his leg. The fabric peeled away with a wet sucking sound. The stink hit him first, pungent and rotten, like meat left too long in the sun. Then he saw them. Dozens, no, hundreds, of white threads undulated just beneath his skin. They weren't hiding anymore. Some of them were finger-length, thickening, no longer content to stay buried. A few had risen so close to the surface that the skin stretched around them like latex pulled tight over a moving wire. Others tunneled, leaving faint trails like veins drawn by a child with a shaky hand. They were fast, coordinated, as if they knew he was watching. Frank choked on his own breath. His fingers hovered uselessly above the wound, trembling. For a long moment he simply stared, wide-eyed and paralyzed. Then he saw one of them break the surface. It pierced the skin like a needle, white and glistening, a sick parody of birth. It wriggled free halfway, still attached somewhere deep inside him, then retreated back into the leg like a serpent into a burrow. That's when Frank lost it. He screamed, a ragged hoarse bellow that echoed down the empty street. The sound scared a nearby pigeon into flight. Somewhere, a car alarm chirped. He doubled over and vomited onto the pavement, hot bile splashing across the sidewalk in his shoe. He was shaking now, not from the cold, from the wrongness of it, the sheer impossibility of what he'd just seen. "I'm losing my goddamn mind," he whispered, forehead pressed against the cold concrete, rain mingled with the tears on his face. This can't be real. But it was. He could feel them burrowing deeper. He crawled back into the narrow shelter of the bookstore's doorway, dragging his leg like dead weight behind him. For hours, he lay curled in a fetal position, clutching at his thigh, his chest heaving. He tried not to think, but he did, about Sarah, about the email that told him she was gone, about the hospital staff who turned him away, about the cold indifference in the eyes of the nurse with the clipboard, about the medal in his coat pocket, still there, useless as ever. Around midnight he sat up. The parasites were quieter now, perhaps resting, or perhaps waiting. He took out the photo of Sarah and held it under the flickering street lamp across the road. Her smile hadn't changed. Even after all these years, she still looked like warmth, like home. "I can't do this anymore," he whispered. "I don't know what's left of me to save." The storm raged on, but in the quiet between gusts, Frank made a decision. Tomorrow, he would try again. One more hospital, one more plea for help. If they turned him away, if no one listened this time, he'd stop asking. He'd stop everything. The heat in Fallujah was unlike anything Frank Murphy had ever known. It wasn't just the temperature, though the thermometer often cracked 120 degrees by midday. It was the way the heat sat on you, pressing into your skin like a second. Uniform, thick with dust, gunpowder, and the sharp tang of diesel fuel. The desert didn't just burn, it devoured. He remembered the smell first. Burnt rubber, spent brass, and something else, something sweet and wrong. The smell of blood and sand. October 2003. His unit had been clearing a road suspected of IED placement just outside Fallujah. The mission was textbook: push forward, sweep for traps, secure the route for an incoming convoy. Frank, already 2 tours in, had been assigned as field medic. His job wasn't to fight. It was to patch, to bandage, to stabilize, to keep the boys breathing long enough to make it home. But that day, nothing had gone by the book. He and Miguel Martinez, 22, lean and full of New England fire, had been walking point together when the first explosion hit. The blast came from beneath the cracked asphalt, throwing dirt, shrapnel, and screams into the air. Private Banks lost a leg. Corporal Ingram died instantly. Frank hit the ground hard, his right calf punctured by what felt like white-hot steel. He didn't know it then, but that was the moment his future began to unravel. The world tilted sideways as gunfire erupted. Frank pulled himself toward the wreckage, blood soaking into the sand beneath him. Miguel was already moving, radio on one shoulder, rifle slung over the other, dragging Banks by the collar through the dust. "Stay down, Frank," Miguel shouted, ducking behind a burnt-out Humvee. "You're bleeding bad. I've got him," Frank shouted back, gesturing to Ingram's body. "Go get Rodriguez." The gunfire intensified, bullets slapped into metal and sandbags. Somewhere up the ridge, the enemy had found good elevation. Miguel cursed and sprinted again, reckless, heroic, stupid. He made it to Rodriguez just as a second IED went off. Frank didn't hear the explosion. He felt it, deep in his chest like a shockwave through bone. He watched Miguel crumple forward, his body covering Rodriguez like a shield. Frank crawled, dragging his leg, ignoring the pain. The enemy didn't stop shooting. But neither did he. By the time reinforcements arrived, Frank had stabilized Rodriguez, applied a field tourniquet to Banks, and begun CPR on Miguel. It was too late. One bullet had gone through the kid's back and lodged near the heart. Another had clipped his neck. He died shielding a man he barely knew. Frank had carried Miguel's body out himself, carried him across the burning sand, past the twisted wreckage of the Humvee, past the others, straight to the waiting medevac. He remembered the heat rising from the metal of the landing skids as the helicopter touched down. And he remembered the water. They'd run out during the mission. The sun had cooked their canteens, and the supply line was delayed. Frank had found an abandoned clay jug near an old farm wall, a makeshift well beside a half-collapsed brick hut. The water was lukewarm, cloudy, but it was all they had. He'd filled his mouth, rinsed and spat, then took another sip and used it to clean the blood off Rodriguez's face. He soaked a rag and pressed it to Banks's forehead. He didn't know. How could he? The parasites had already entered his system, invisible and patient. They would wait. Months, years, long after the medals, long after the funerals, long after Miguel Martinez was zipped into a flag-covered bag and sent home to a daughter he'd never see again. They gave him the Medal of Honor 6 months later. It arrived not in a quiet moment, but with cameras, speeches, and a crowd of people who didn't know what Fallujah had smelled like. They gathered in a manicured rose garden, sunlight reflecting off medals and dress uniforms, and told stories about bravery. Frank stood rigid as the president draped the ribbon around his neck. Applause broke out. Somewhere in the crowd, Sarah smiled tightly, her hand gripping Michael's shoulder, while Lisa fidgeted beside them. But Frank's mind wasn't there. He was back in the dirt, back in the sand, tasting blood, wiping grit from Rodriguez's eyes, back in the helicopter, holding Miguel's dog tags so tightly that they cut into his palm. He had given everything that day, more than blood, more than pain. He had lost a brother. Now the country wanted to thank him. They wanted to give him medals and newspaper headlines, but no one wanted to talk about the price. That night, back in the hotel room, Sarah tried to celebrate. She wore her best dress, the one Frank had mailed to her from Kuwait City after his first tour. There was champagne, a small chocolate cake the hotel sent up with a thank you card, and 2 children trying to be proud of a man they barely remembered. Frank sat on the edge of the bed, the medal still around his neck, staring at the static on the television. "You were amazing out there," Sarah whispered, brushing his hair back gently. "I'm so proud of you." He didn't answer. "Frank," she said again, softer now, "you saved lives." He looked at her then, not at her face, but at her eyes. The lines around them were deeper. The sparkle had dulled. There was something exhausted behind them, something he hadn't noticed before. "Did I?" he asked, voice hoarse. Sarah blinked. "What do you mean?" "Miguel's dead. Ingram's dead." "I held his lungs in my hands, Sarah. I couldn't save him. I couldn't save any of them. You saved 12 others. Then why do I only remember the ones who didn't come home?" She had no answer. Neither did he. That was the last night they slept in the same bed. Over the following months, the war took more than his friends. It took his time, his health. It took Sarah, slowly and cruelly, through a cancer he didn't catch in time. While he was on his second tour, holding the wounded in desert sun, she was wasting away in a Boston hospital, alone except for the kids. Michael never forgave him. Lisa tried to. And Frank? He never forgave himself. He kept the Medal of Honor in a waterproof pouch, pressed between Sarah's final photo and a creased image of his squad in Iraq, not because he wanted to protect it, but because he couldn't bear to look at it anymore. He told himself the wound in his leg was just shrapnel, a ghost of that day, something left behind as a reminder. But sometimes, when the pain throbbed too sharply to ignore, he wondered if it was something worse, something living, a punishment maybe, or a curse. He never sought help. Help was paperwork, and lines, and questions he didn't want to answer. Help was reliving Fallujah in fluorescent rooms with indifferent faces, so he wrapped it. Every day, t-shirts, towels, whatever he could find, and he moved on, or tried to. Now, under the howling wind and cold rain of a Boston autumn, Frank Murphy sat beneath the Charlestown Bridge with that same leg pressed tight to his chest, his fingers numb and stiff. The skin around the old wound pulsed in time with the storm. Something squirmed beneath it, just beneath the surface. He flinched. A pain flashed up his thigh, sharp and searing. The ghosts never left, he thought. They just changed shape. The waiting room at the Meridian Street Community Health Center was painted in calming blues and faded whites, a color scheme clearly chosen by someone who had never waited here. The plastic chairs squeaked beneath shifting bodies. The air smelled of disinfectant and desperation. Children cried. Someone coughed wetly in the corner. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like dying bees. Frank Murphy sat in the farthest seat from the front desk, his right leg stretched out. Stiffly in front of him, wrapped in a Red Sox t-shirt already darkened with seepage. The smell coming off it was sharp and sour, like spoiled meat and iron. He kept his coat buttoned tight to cover the stench, but it didn't matter. People still gave him wide berth. The receptionist didn't look up when his number was called, just mumbled it. 36? He stood slowly, using a broken broomstick as a cane. Each step was a lightning bolt up his thigh. He moved past the line of weary mothers and aging construction workers toward the open door. Dr. Patricia Williams didn't stand when he entered. She didn't smile. She didn't even remove her stethoscope. She just gestured to the paper-covered table with a nod. Back again, Mr. Murphy? Frank lowered himself with difficulty onto the table, his breath coming in shallow gasps. It's worse. She typed something into the computer without glancing at him. It's been 3 weeks since your last visit. Any new symptoms? He hesitated, then looked down at the bandaged leg. It's moving, he said. Dr. Williams looked up sharply. Pardon? Frank met her eyes. There's something inside it. Moving. I can feel it. It's not in my head. She blinked, then returned to the screen. You mentioned a similar sensation last time. We discussed how PTSD can manifest somatically. I'm not imagining this, he snapped, more sharply than he intended. It's not a memory. It's not a flashback. I can see it move sometimes. Have you considered seeing a VA mental health counselor? She asked flatly. Frank laughed bitterly. They booked me an appointment 6 months from now. I'll be dead before then. Dr. Williams pursed her lips. You're not the only patient with urgent needs, Mr. Murphy. The system's strained. The system, he echoed, his voice low and rough, hasn't worked for me in 20 years. Silence filled the room. Outside, a baby screamed and someone cursed in Spanish. Dr. Williams finally stood. Let me take a look. She approached, snapping on latex gloves. Frank unwrapped the bandage slowly, revealing skin that had turned the color of spoiled milk. The edges of the wound were inflamed, slick with pus. Threads of something pale and stringy squirmed just beneath the surface, shifting like wind through grass, but under the clinical light, it was subtle, almost deniable. Dr. Williams frowned but said nothing. This looks like a chronic infection, complicated by poor hygiene and self-care. There's no visible sign of foreign bodies. There are worms under my skin, Frank said quietly. She sighed. Mr. Murphy, you're 72. You've experienced combat trauma, loss, homelessness. Your mind has been under severe strain for decades. The brain sometimes misinterprets physical sensations. It happens. It doesn't mean you're crazy, just overwhelmed. Frank clenched his fists. You think I'm imagining this? I think you're suffering, she said gently. But I don't believe there are worms living in your leg. She printed a prescription. I'm increasing your antibiotics. Try to keep the wound dry and clean. I'm also referring you again to mental health services. Frank stood slowly, taking the paper with shaking hands. Thank you, doctor, he said, voice flat. She offered a polite nod. Next patient, please. As Frank limped down the hall toward the exit, he passed a poster near the door. A smiling soldier in uniform stared out beside the words, "The VA is here for you. You are not alone." He didn't look at it. Outside, the sky had turned from gray to black, the first fat drops of rain falling as Frank stepped into the street. He didn't pull up his hood. He didn't rush. The prescription in his hand began to dissolve in the rain, ink bleeding like an old wound. The rain fell harder as Frank made his way across Meridian Street, each drop striking his skin like needles. His leg felt like it was filled with fire. The pain wasn't dull or throbbing anymore. It was sharp, violent. Every step sent a fresh shock through his spine, but he kept walking. Boston Medical Center was 4 blocks away. He didn't expect kindness, just necessity, just triage. Maybe someone would finally cut into his leg and see what he already knew. Maybe finally he wouldn't be treated like a liar. The automatic doors hissed open as Frank limped inside. The lobby was bright, clinical, humming with quiet urgency. A woman behind the reception glass looked up from her screen as he approached. Wet, shivering, and leaning heavily on the splintered broomstick, she gave him a practiced smile that disappeared as her eyes dropped to the soaked towel wrapped around his calf, already stained through with pus and blood. The smell arrived a second later, unmistakable even under hospital-grade air conditioning. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked cautiously. "No," Frank rasped. "I need help. It's urgent." She hesitated, glancing toward a nurse seated nearby. "I have something alive in my leg," Frank said louder, pushing the towel back slightly to show the raw, festering wound. "It's moving." The nurse stood up quickly. "Sir, I need you to calm down. I'm not angry," he said. "I'm dying." The nurse moved closer, her expression guarded. "Let's get you checked in, okay?" She led him to a curtained exam bay and helped him onto the bed. A tech took his blood pressure and temperature, then disappeared without a word. Minutes passed, then 20, then 40. Frank lay staring at the speckled ceiling tiles, his leg pulsing like a second heart. Finally, a young doctor in blue scrubs entered, glancing down at a clipboard. "Mr. Murphy?" Frank nodded weakly. "You're uninsured?" the doctor asked without preamble. "I applied through the VA. It's pending," Frank said, already sensing the shift. The doctor didn't respond to that. He lifted the towel and stared at the wound. Frank watched his eyes for recognition, for shock, for anything, but all he got was fatigue. "Sir, this is a serious infection," the doctor said, "but without insurance or proof of coverage, we can't authorize non-emergency surgery at this time. We'll give you antibiotics and a list of resources for homeless individuals. There's a clinic on Tremont that takes walk-ins." "I don't need a list," Frank snapped. "I need a scalpel." The doctor flinched, then stepped back. "Security is going to help you to the discharge area. I'm sorry." Frank sat there, stunned. Two orderlies appeared at the edge of the curtain like shadows. "You can't be serious," he whispered, but they were. Outside, the rain was biblical. Wind whipped around the corner of the building as the doors hissed shut behind him, leaving Frank alone beneath the awning. His towel bandage was soaked through, hanging limp like a dead thing. His leg throbbed with a fury that brought stars to his vision. He took 3 limping steps forward, then collapsed. The sidewalk struck him hard. His shoulder cracked against the wet concrete, and he screamed, not from the fall, but from what came next. His leg shifted, not with pain, with purpose. He tore the soaked towel away. In the fluorescent glow from the hospital's facade, he saw the skin bulge and ripple. One long pale thread moved beneath the surface, then 2, then a dozen, each one pushing against the skin like they were ready to break free. Frank gasped, trembling. "No, no, no, no." The wind howled. From the street, headlights passed, but no one stopped. No one ever did. Frank forced himself upright, dragging his body toward the edge of the building, where a recessed pharmacy entrance offered the illusion of shelter. He collapsed there, curled against the glass, pressing his forehead to the cold brick. He unwrapped the last dry piece of cloth he had, a torn scrap from an old flannel shirt, and wound it tightly around the leg. The movement beneath the skin slowed, but didn't stop. He exhaled hard, his breath fogging the glass. Rain beat against the sidewalk in steady rhythm, like a funeral drum. Across the street, a neon sign flickered in and out, open 24 hours. But nothing, it seemed, was truly open to him. Frank didn't remember when the rain stopped. At some point, the downpour faded into mist, and the cold turned from biting to bone deep. His back ached from the hours spent curled in the pharmacy alcove. His breath came in shallow pants. His fingers wouldn't stop shaking, and his thoughts came in fragments, images from another life. A hand, reaching for his in the desert. Sarah's voice on a crackling phone line. The letter he never got to answer. His eyes flicked open just before dawn, the weak blue light of early morning casting shadows across the sidewalk. Boston stirred around him, delivery trucks rumbling, commuters hustling. Past, their umbrellas casting moving shadows over the ground. None of them saw him. None of them stopped. Frank didn't blame them anymore. He had become part of the city's background noise, one more ghost huddled in an urban corner. He had watched too many men vanish into the cracks to believe anyone would crawl in after them. But this morning felt different. The pain had grown teeth. His entire leg throbbed with a rhythm that no longer matched his heartbeat. Something inside was pulsing. He moved his hand to his calf, pressing gently. He expected the usual heat and swelling. What he felt instead was motion. And this time, it wasn't subtle. Frank gasped as the sensation rose beneath his skin like boiling water. Then he saw it. His pant leg rippled. He blinked. Once, twice. It happened again. One long ripple moving from ankle to knee, like something tunneling just beneath the surface. He choked on the bile rising in his throat. Desperately, he fumbled at the buttons of his pants and yanked the fabric up past his knee. The sight was impossible. His leg was alive. Dozens of white filaments shifted visibly beneath the thin, purple-tinged skin. Some curled like snakes around each other, while others moved in straight, twitching lines. A few had reached his upper thigh. One of them pressed so hard against the skin that Frank feared it might rupture through. He screamed, a raw, wordless sound that startled a nearby pigeon into flight. Frank clutched his head. "It's not in my mind," he whispered hoarsely, teeth chattering. "It's real. Oh God, it's real." The fever made everything swim. His vision blurred. He pressed his head against the cold concrete, panting through the pain, trying to stay conscious, trying not to claw the skin off his leg just to dig them out. He thought of Sarah again. She would have known what to do. She always had. Her voice whispered to him, not from memory but from somewhere deeper. "You have to hold on, Frank, just a little longer." He sobbed into his arm. "I can't," he whispered. "I don't have anything left." But just as the darkness crept closer, a voice cut through the fog. "Oh my God, is he okay?" Frank flinched. He didn't know if it was real. His body had betrayed him too many times to trust any new sound. Sir, can you hear me?" It wasn't a hallucination. Two figures stood just feet away, a young woman and a man, both in formal wear, their umbrellas abandoned in the rush. The woman crouched carefully, her heels clicking on the wet sidewalk. Frank tried to speak but only managed a guttural rasp. "Call 911, she said sharply to her partner. "Now. He's burning up." Frank's vision narrowed to a tunnel. His leg throbbed like it might explode. But somewhere, in the part of his brain that still clung to reality, he realized something extraordinary. Someone had seen him. The ambulance pulled up within 6 minutes. It felt like an eternity to the young woman kneeling beside Frank Murphy, who hadn't stopped shaking. His leg was twitching now, the skin rippling with disturbing regularity. She'd seen abscesses before. She'd even seen a man's arm swell up from a spider bite once, but nothing like this. Nothing moving beneath the skin. Sirens faded as Jenny Martinez and her partner, Marcus, jumped out. Jenny had been working nights in Boston EMS for over a decade. She'd seen overdoses, gunshot wounds, blunt trauma from traffic collisions. But the moment she reached Frank and lifted the soaked Red Sox blanket he had used to cover his leg, she stopped cold. "What the hell?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Frank's pant leg had fallen away, revealing the full extent of the wound. The skin looked almost translucent in places, stretched thin over angry purple veins and pulsing clusters of white filaments. One of them twitched just beneath the surface as she watched, slow and deliberate. Her stomach lurched. "Marcus," she said without taking her eyes off the leg, "get me trauma pads, wide-bore IV, and alert Mass General. Priority 1. Her voice snapped into professional command, though her hands trembled. She had never seen a wound so clearly alive. As Marcus relayed the call, the young couple stepped back, watching wide-eyed from the curb. The woman had tears in her eyes. "Is he going to make it?" Jenny glanced up, registering them for the first time. "You did the right thing calling us. That probably saved his life." Frank let out a low moan, his head rolling weakly toward her. "Stay with me, mister. What's your name?" His mouth moved. No sound came out. Jenny leaned closer. "Murphy," he rasped. "Frank Murphy." Jenny froze for a fraction of a second. Murphy? The name wasn't uncommon, but something clicked in her mind. A story her father had told her growing up. A hero from Iraq. The man her father had died protecting. No, it couldn't be. She shoved the thought aside and focused on stabilizing the patient. The infection was bad. No, catastrophic. His blood pressure was dangerously low. Skin temperature inconsistent. The leg wound was excreting some kind of clear fluid now, tinged with pink. She swore she could see movement within the fluid itself. She applied pressure pads as best she could, and began the fourth the whole leg might have. To come off, she thought grimly. But if they didn't move fast, none of that would matter. As they loaded Frank onto the stretcher, his tattered Salvation Army jacket slid open. And there, tucked beneath his flannel layers, gleamed something that made Jenny freeze again. A medal. Not just any medal. Blue ribbon, gold star, white center, the Medal of Honor. Jenny's breath hitched in her throat. She looked back at Frank's face, sunken, sickly, weathered by time and suffering. But now she saw something else. Beneath the grime and gray hair, there was the faintest trace of a photograph. She had seen 100 times in her father's old footlocker. A face beside her dad's in a crumpled picture taken in the desert sands of Iraq. "Oh my God," she whispered. "It's him." Marcus looked over. "What?" She didn't answer. She was already inside the ambulance, gripping Frank's hand as the doors slammed shut behind them. The drive to Massachusetts General Hospital took less than 7 minutes. Jenny stayed by Frank's side the entire time, monitoring vitals, squeezing fluids, adjusting the oxygen mask when it slipped. The parasitic motion in his leg grew more aggressive as the minutes ticked by, as if the worms knew their time was up. When they arrived, the trauma bay lights flicked on like stadium spotlights, illuminating a dozen professionals ready to receive the case. "Severe parasitic infection," Jenny said as they wheeled Frank in. "Unknown species, chronic, possibly decades old. He's crashing. We need immediate trauma intervention." Dr. Robert Chen, already scrubbing in, met her eyes. "Where was he found?" "Beacon Street. Collapsed outside a CVS. He has no ID except for this." She handed over the Medal of Honor. Dr. Chen paused, registering the significance. Jenny added quietly, "His name is Frank Murphy." Something passed across Dr. Chen's face, a mix of disbelief, horror, and dawning outrage. He turned to the trauma team. "Prep or 3. We go in now." Jenny watched as they rushed Frank away. The automatic doors closed behind them with a hiss, and for the first time in 2 decades, Frank Murphy was no longer fighting alone. The surgical lights above the operating table cast a stark, sterile glow. Dr. Robert Chen stood at the head of the trauma bay, fully scrubbed, his gloved hands hovering over Frank Murphy's leg. Beside him, nurses moved with practice speed, prepping instruments, monitoring vitals, adjusting suction tubes. But even their movements carried a tension that hadn't been there minutes ago. Frank lay unconscious, his chest rising and falling beneath the oxygen mask. His vitals were weak but stable, for now. His right leg, propped and exposed beneath the light, was a grotesque canvas of inflammation, necrosis, and something else entirely. Dr. Chen had seen infections before: gangrene, diabetic ulcers, buried parasites in refugees from tropical regions. But never this. Never movement. The moment he made the first incision, the room went quiet. No alarms, no monitors, just silence. He pulled back the first layer of skin carefully, revealing swollen muscle tissues slick with yellowish fluid. Then he saw it. A ripple, slow and methodical, traveled across the exposed muscle, as if something just beneath it had felt the scalpel's touch. The nurse beside him gasped. "Did you see that?" "Retractor," Chen said quickly, regaining control. "Suction here. I want the specimen exposed." Another incision, deeper this time. A pocket of fluid burst, and with it came a smell so foul that even the most experienced nurse gagged behind her mask. But no one moved away. Chen leaned closer. Beneath the tissue, pale tendrils wriggled, not like worms but something finer, more intelligent. They moved in concert, as though responding to the light. One of them coiled like a thread around the surgical tool, then recoiled violently when touched by the metal. "What in the hell?" Chen whispered. "Doctor, is it a parasite?" "I don't know what it is," he said. He reached for a forceps and gently grasped one of the filaments. It resisted, then snapped loose from the tissue with a sudden pop. As he lifted it from the leg, the thing writhed violently, twisting in the air like a strand of white-hot wire. It thrashed against the instrument, then abruptly went still. Chen dropped it into a steel tray. The movement resumed instantly, coiling and writhing again, this time in patterns. It was trying to escape, the entire, or stared at it. "Get pathology down here, and infectious disease, and call CDC." His voice was calm, but it cut like steel. "This man is infected with something we've never seen before." One of the interns finally broke the silence. "Should we be in hazmat?" "Too late now," Chen muttered. "Close the wound for now. We stabilize him. Then we isolate the parasite. We need containment first, not curiosity." He turned to the anesthesiologist. "Keep him under, and for God's sake, don't let him wake up screaming." Outside the OR, Jenny Martinez paced the hallway. She'd changed into clean scrubs, but her hands still shook. The sight of Frank's leg, alive, writhing, intelligent, had shaken her deeper than she admitted. She'd seen enough trauma in her life to become numb to pain. But not this. This was something new. She pulled out her phone and opened the photo album. There, between snapshots of accident scenes and family holidays, was the old scanned image she'd taken from her father's war box. 2 men in tan fatigues, standing under a blistering Middle Eastern sun. One of them was her dad. The other was Frank Murphy. She looked at the image again, then at the OR doors. What had happened to him? What had the war buried in that sand that followed him back home? And more importantly, why had no one helped him until now? Inside the pathology lab, the parasite twitched beneath a sealed glass dome, writhing like it was trying to remember how to escape. Dr. Patricia Williams adjusted the microscope and frowned. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a taut bun, and her latex gloves trembled slightly, not from fear, but awe. "This isn't a standard dracunculus," she said to the cluster of specialists gathered around her. "It's not behaving like any known species. It's anaerobic, photoreactive, and appears to respond to electrical pulses." "You mean it's aware?" asked Dr. Lisa Park, an infectious disease fellow. Williams exhaled. "I'm saying it's organized. These worms, they're coordinated. There's some sort of neural synchronization happening. Look at the way they retract when one of them is exposed. They're communicating." Another parasite slithered against the glass, leaving behind a faint secretion that began to corrode the inner wall. Williams stiffened. "We need to double containment. If this gets out, we're not just talking about a veteran's infection. We're talking about an event." A younger lab tech gulped, staring at the parasitic trail. "Are we even safe in here?" Williams didn't answer. She didn't need to. Meanwhile, Frank lay in the ICU, cocooned in a fortress of machines. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the room. His leg was wrapped in sterile gauze, secured with transparent film to isolate whatever remained inside. Dr. Chen had only partially debrided the infection. Full removal, he warned, might be fatal. He hadn't woken up since surgery, but his eyelids twitched as if caught in a fever dream. In his mind, the desert was alive. The sun was a crucible above Fallujah, turning the sand to glass. He staggered through a wrecked convoy, blood trickling down his calf where shrapnel had torn through skin. Behind him, a voice called out, "Murphy, you hearing me?" It was Miguel Martinez. Frank turned. Miguel was holding his radio, waving frantically, his mouth moving, screaming, maybe, but the words were lost to a sudden roaring silence. The ground pulsed, the sand shifted. Then he saw it, a ripple beneath the desert floor, moving toward them. Alive, hungry. The worms had followed him from Iraq. He reached for Miguel, trying to scream a warning, but his throat was full of sand, his hands too slow. Miguel's face turned from hope to horror as the ground split beneath them, and Frank jolted awake with a ragged gasp. The beeping on the monitors spiked. Jenny Martinez, seated quietly at the foot of the bed, dropped her tablet. "Frank?" His eyes fluttered open, confusion, pain, then recognition, not of her, but of something. "The worms," he rasped. "They're still in me." Jenny leaned forward, voice calm, soothing, practiced. "You're safe now. You're at Mass General. They're working on it." He tried to sit up. Failed. "You shouldn't be near me. No one should." Jenny shook her head. "You don't get to decide that." He blinked at her, as if only now noticing the familiarity in her features, the same cheekbones, the same gaze. Then his eyes dropped to the locket around her neck, army insignia embedded in silver. Who are you?" Jenny hesitated, then slowly pulled out the weathered photo from her jacket pocket, the one of her father, standing beside a younger Frank Murphy. "I think you knew my dad," she said. "Miguel Martinez, Iraq, 2004. Frank's breath caught. He stared at the photo, then at her, and something crumpled behind his eyes. He saved me." Jenny nodded. "You saved each other. I've been carrying this photo my whole life." Tears slipped down the corner of Frank's temple. He didn't make it out. "I know." For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Machines beeped. Rain tapped against the hospital window, and the silence between them turned sacred. "You were there," Jenny whispered, her voice thick. "He talked about you in his last letter, said you were the kind of man he'd want his daughter to meet one day." Frank closed his eyes. A breath shuddered through him. Not pain this time, but release. In the hallway, Dr. Chen approached the observation window, watching the exchange. "That woman," he murmured to Dr. Park. "Park. She's not just saving his life, she's saving his soul." Dr. Park nodded. "It's strange, isn't it? Parasites feed in the dark, but healing needs light." Chen looked back at Frank, who now slept peacefully, Jenny's hand resting lightly over his. "Let's make sure he lives long enough to feel the sun again." Frank awoke to the sound of low conversation and the faint smell of antiseptic. His eyelids felt like sandpaper, but the pressure in his leg was less. Not gone, not healed, but muted, as if whatever had taken root inside him had finally gone to sleep. The light above his bed was dimmed, casting soft halos against the sterile white ceiling. He blinked, slowly, adjusting to the new surroundings. A different room now. Quieter, cleaner. For the first time in days, or perhaps weeks, he felt warm. "Hey," came a soft voice. "Welcome back." He turned his head. Jenny sat in a chair beside his bed, a tablet in her lap, a warm cup of something steaming in her hand. Her eyes were tired, but they lit up when he moved. "How long?" Frank asked, his voice ragged, barely above a whisper. "Almost 36 hours since surgery," Jenny said gently. "You've been stable for the last 10. That's good." Frank nodded slowly. He looked down at his leg, now wrapped in pristine gauze. Tubes ran from his arm, beeping quietly with every heartbeat. "I'm still here," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Yeah." Jenny smiled softly. "You are." He turned to her. "Why'd you stay?" She hesitated, then held up the photo again, her father and Frank in uniform. Arms slung around each other, dust and sun in the backdrop. "You saved my father. I think I owed you at least one night." Frank's throat tightened. He looked away, eyes misting. "I didn't save him. He saved me." Jenny shook her head. "You both saved each other. And now it's my turn." Before Frank could respond, the door opened. Dr. Chen entered, holding a thick file, followed by Dr. Patricia Williams and a young assistant with a tablet. "Good morning, Mr. Murphy," Chen said, offering a measured smile. "Glad to see you with us." Frank gave a tired nod. "I've had better mornings. You'll be having better ones from here on out, if we can help it." Chen stepped closer. "There are some things we need to discuss. About your condition." Frank nodded again, bracing. Dr. Williams took over. "We've identified the organisms in your leg. They're not any known parasitic species. They're genetically closer to marine ribbon worms, but with features that suggest extreme adaptation, anaerobic capability, intelligent motility, and most concerning, possible host integration." Frank blinked. "What the hell does that mean?" "It means they weren't just in your body," Dr. Chen said. "They were responding to it, living with it, symbiotically, but aggressively." Jenny leaned forward. "But they're contained now, right?" Chen nodded. "Yes, for now. We were able to extract a large portion of the colony, but some strands may remain dormant in your system. We're coordinating with the CDC and Department of Defense for additional support." Frank frowned. "Why them?" Dr. Williams exchanged a look with Chen before replying. "Because these organisms appear to have originated from a conflict zone. Iraq, specifically. Your service records indicate a severe wound sustained near Fallujah. Based on the growth patterns and latency of the infection, we believe that's when they entered your body." Frank closed his eyes. The well, the dirty water, the heat and blood. It's been over 20 years. Dr. Chen nodded grimly. "And they've been adapting all that time. Growing, waiting." Frank took a shaky breath. "Why now? Why are they active now?" "We don't know yet," Williams admitted. "But we're looking into factors. Aging immune systems, environmental triggers, chemical exposure." Jenny stood up. "What happens next?" Chen flipped open the folder. "We monitor him in containment. We begin a new round of imaging, run immune assays, and bring in specialists. If the parasites begin to multiply again, we'll consider full systemic treatment. Experimental antifungals, gene editing therapies, even amputation if necessary." Frank didn't flinch. He simply said, "Do whatever you have to. Just don't send me away again." "You're not going anywhere," Jenny said firmly. For the first time, Frank believed her. Later that afternoon, Jenny stood alone on the hospital's rooftop garden, the wind tugging gently at her scrubs. Below her, the city pulsed with late-day traffic and office lights blinking to life. Boston never really rested. It just shifted gears. She looked down at the tablet in her hands, scrolling through Frank's declassified service records. Operation Phantom Fury. Fallujah. A Medal of Honor awarded for saving 12 lives under fire. Injured, left behind by the system. And for 2 decades, forgotten, until now. She glanced at her email inbox. Messages were already pouring in. Subject, "We know who he is." Subject, "Former corpsman identified at Mass General." Subject: the man who saved my brother in Iraq. He's alive? Jenny hadn't gone public with the full story. She never would. Not about the parasites, not yet. That part was too strange, too dangerous, too incomplete. But she had sent a short note to a small group of veteran networks and journalists she trusted. A Medal of Honor recipient was found unconscious outside a pharmacy in downtown Boston. His name is Frank Murphy. For 20 years he's lived on the margins, forgotten, ignored. He is now stable and under medical care. We owe him better. Please share respectfully. Do not exploit. He deserves dignity, not pity. She hadn't expected what came next. The veteran community exploded with grief, anger, and guilt. Men and women from units Frank had supported wrote in. A former Marine medic in Florida offered to pay for part of his care. A woman in Idaho, who'd served as a nurse in the Green Zone, sent flowers. With a simple note, he was always the one who stayed calm. One message made Jenny stop cold. My name is Rebecca Martinez. I'm Miguel's wife. Thank you for finding him. Please tell Frank he was never forgotten. My daughter has grown up hearing his name like a prayer. Jenny read that message 3 times. Downstairs, Dr. Chen sat in a secure conference room with 2 unfamiliar men in dark suits. One was from the CDC. The other bore no ID at all, but his tone and posture screamed military intelligence. We're not releasing the organism yet, Chen said firmly. His fingers steepled in front of him. It's still alive, still active in some form. We understand, said the CDC representative. We're not here to confiscate. We're here to contain. The other man leaned forward. Dr. Chen, do you know how many unexplained cases of immune collapse we've documented in veterans from the same region over the last 20 years? Chen frowned. No, 17, all unexplained, all dismissed as mental health, substance abuse, or chronic infection. Most never followed up. But this, he slid a flash drive across the table. This might be the thread that ties them together. Chen took the drive without speaking. We'll work with you, the CDC man said, but this can't leave the hospital, not without protocols, not without clearance. Chen finally nodded. We'll keep him here. You'll get your samples, but he's not a specimen, he's a patient. The man gave a thin smile. Agreed. Back in the ICU, Frank was sitting up for the first time, a tray of untouched hospital food beside him. Jenny entered quietly, holding a small stack of letters. What's all that? He asked, his voice still gravelly. Mail, she said. For you. He looked at her skeptically. Junk mail? She shook her head. People who served with you. People you helped. Even a few reporters who somehow didn't ruin the story yet. Frank stared at the stack. I didn't think anyone would remember. They do, Jenny said. You were never invisible. They just forgot how to look. She handed him the top envelope. He opened it slowly, pulling out a handwritten letter. The first lines made his throat close. You don't know me, but I was in the convoy you helped get out of Fallujah. You pulled my sergeant out from under a burning truck. I thought you were a ghost, but I saw your name today and realized, ghosts don't bleed. Frank folded the letter carefully and looked away, blinking fast. I'm not used to this, he said. Jenny sat beside him. It's not charity, Frank, it's recognition, and it's long overdue. The observation room was sealed behind 2 sets of glass and negative air pressure. Inside, under sterile white lights, the parasite writhed, contained but restless. Dr. Patricia Williams stood at the lab bench, flanked by 2 CDC biologists, and a neurovirologist from Johns Hopkins, who had flown in the night before. The worm-like organism was stretched across a glass slide under an electron microscope. What it revealed sent a quiet shock through the team. This isn't just parasitic tissue, Williams said, tapping the image on the monitor. It's laced with axon-like fibers, neural structures. You're saying it has a nervous system? Asked the neurovirologist, frowning. More than that, she replied. These aren't random. They're organized into clusters, like ganglia. And look here. She pointed to a heat mapping overlay. It's reacting to stimulus in real time. When we adjusted the temperature, this entire section pulsed, not just reflexively, synchronously. One of the CDC biologists leaned forward. That's not a parasite. That's a symbiont, or worse, an invader with cognitive capability. The word cognitive hung in the air like a bad smell. Williams took a breath. We're seeing signs that this organism can interact with its host's nervous system, possibly influence it, maybe even enhance it under certain conditions. Enhance how? Heightened stress tolerance, temporary boosts in reflex activity, sensory perception. One of the CDC agents muttered, "You mean like a biological performance enhancer?" "No, more like an ancient intelligence looking for a ride." Meanwhile, in his hospital room, Frank Murphy stared at the ceiling with glassy eyes, trying to ignore the sensations that kept crawling along the edges of his awareness. He wasn't in pain, at least not like before, but something had shifted. His dreams, once a blurry cacophony of war and ghosts, were now clear, too clear, vivid to the point of discomfort. He remembered the serial number of a rifle from a battle 20 years ago, the smell of Sarah's hair on the last night they'd danced in the kitchen, the name of the Iraqi boy who'd handed him a bottle of water at the gate the morning before everything went wrong. He remembered everything. He'd asked the nurses for fewer pain meds. He wanted clarity, not sedation. The thoughts in his head weren't jumbled anymore. They were sharp, alarming, and sometimes they weren't his. He didn't want to admit it, not even to Jenny, but at night, when the monitors dimmed and the hallway sound softened, he could hear something. Not a voice exactly, a presence. Sometimes it was just a feeling, a pull toward the window, a desire to stand barefoot on cold tile, to close his eyes and listen. Other times, it came with flashes of understanding, brief and inexplicable, like knowing who was about to enter the room before the door opened, or sensing fear in someone's voice, even when their face smiled. He hadn't told anyone. Not yet. He didn't want to go back to being labeled delusional, but the parasite was still inside him, part of it. Dormant, maybe, but not dead. He could feel it. Later that day, Jenny entered with a laptop balanced on her arm. "Got something you need to see." Frank sat up, alert. She pulled up a live feed video from the lab. "Dr. Williams let me sit in on part of the briefing this morning. They've confirmed what they suspected, which is..." She paused. "It's neural. The parasite. It's been latching onto your nervous system for decades, and now that they've disturbed it, it's responding." Frank's mouth tightened. "How bad is it?" Jenny tilted her head. "That depends on how you're feeling." Frank didn't answer right away. Then he looked at her, not with fear, but with a strange, haunted curiosity. "I feel awake," he said slowly, "like something's been cleared out of my mind. I remember things I shouldn't. I see things more sharply. I hear thoughts that aren't mine. And I don't know if that should terrify me or not." Jenny didn't flinch. "Then maybe it's time we stop thinking of this as just an infection." In the restricted biocontainment lab, the lights dimmed to near darkness. As Dr. Williams initiated the next phase of observation, the parasite, safely housed inside a reinforced acrylic chamber, shifted visibly, its pale tendrils curling toward the heat sensors embedded along the walls. Pulse activity rising, the CDC biologist noted. Temperature unchanged, but look at the EEG. They weren't just running biological tests anymore. Williams had insisted on wiring the chamber with modified neurological monitoring equipment, tools usually used in human brain mapping studies. And now the parasite was responding, rhythmically, intentionally. "We've tried electrical pulses, light frequency changes, even pheromonal triggers," she said quietly. "But what got the strongest reaction was sound." The Johns Hopkins neurologist adjusted a dial. "You're sure it isn't just vibration?" No. It responded differently depending on tone structure. Higher cognition tones produce synchronized motion. It's not just reacting, it's processing." He stared at the screen, watching the live waveforms as the creature contracted and expanded in repeating patterns. "It's trying to talk," he muttered. "Or listen," William said. In his hospital bed, Frank woke from a half-sleep with a jolt, his body slick with sweat despite the cold room. For a moment, he thought he'd heard someone whispering his name, but no one was there. The room was empty. No nurses, no Jenny, just the steady beep of the monitor and the muted city noise behind sealed windows. Except, there it was again. Murphy. The voice was not a voice. It didn't come through his ears, it formed in his mind. He sat up, heart hammering. "Who's there?" he whispered hoarsely. No answer. But something shifted inside his leg. Something felt the question. Suddenly, memories poured into him. Not like dreams, but like files opening all at once. He saw the well in Fallujah, the little boy handing him a bottle. The moment he crouched down to clean his wound with that same water, too distracted. to notice the silken threads clinging to the rim of the container. He remembered now, not the pain, but the sensation, a warmth spreading under his skin, the illusion of healing, not harm. And in that moment 20 years ago, something had entered him quietly and begun to learn. Frank clutched the sheets. "Why now?" he asked silently. The answer came not in words but in knowing. Because it had matured, because it had waited, because now it needed him. Later that evening, Jenny returned to find Frank sitting up, eyes focused, on the far wall like he was solving a puzzle no one else could see. "You okay?" she asked softly. "I remember it," he said without looking at her. "How it got in, why it stayed quiet." Jenny took a step closer. "What do you mean?" "It didn't want to kill me. Not at first. It wanted to survive, and it needed me to do that. So it kept me alive, fed off my trauma, my rage, my memories. All those years, every moment I thought I was losing my mind, it was learning how I think." Jenny's spine prickled. "Frank, this thing inside you, it's not just parasitic, is it?" "No," he said. "It's aware, and now, it's awake." She sat down beside him, her voice steady. "Can you feel it now?" He nodded. "It's not talking, not in words, but I can feel its thoughts, like pressure behind my own. It knows I know." Jenny swallowed hard. "What does it want?" He looked at her for the first time that evening. "I don't know yet," he said, "but it's not afraid anymore." Back in the lab, William stepped away from the glass as the parasite pulsed in tight, controlled spirals. She watched the waveform closely. Then something changed. The creature stopped moving for a full 20 seconds, flatlined, and then, in a sudden, precise burst, it released a new pulse, one that aligned perfectly with the human theta brainwave pattern. Everyone froze. "Did it just mimic a neural signal?" someone whispered. Dr. Williams didn't answer. She was staring at the screen, where a real-time rendering showed the signal echoing inside the loop. Not just mimicry. Contact. Frank Murphy sat alone in the quiet of the ICU, the hum of machines steady around him. Night had fallen, and with it came the clarity he had come to recognize, not just in thought, but in perception. The parasite, whatever it truly was, had stopped hiding. It pulsed inside him now, not with pain, but with presence. It was no longer just a passenger. It was a part of him. He stared at the 4-line, the sterile bandages wrapped around his leg, and the reflection of himself in the darkened window. He didn't see a hero. He saw a man fractured by war, forgotten by his country, and now, transformed by something no one fully understood. Not even him. Footsteps echoed outside. The door opened. Jenny stepped in quietly, followed by Dr. Robert Chen and a woman Frank hadn't seen before. She wore a dark navy suit with no insignia, only a badge clipped at her waist. Her posture was rigid, military, but her eyes, sharp, alert, didn't carry the warmth of medicine. This wasn't a doctor. Frank straightened. Jenny looked uneasy. Chen's hands were clasped too tightly. "Mr. Murphy," the woman began, stepping forward. "I'm Agent Lydia Warren, Department of Defense. I'm here on behalf of the Joint Biothreat Command. You are now considered a Class 3 national interest subject. Effective immediately, the federal government is asserting jurisdiction over your case." Frank tilted his head. "You mean custody?" Warren didn't flinch. "For your safety and ours, yes. Your condition, and the organism inside you, pose potential risks that require federal oversight." Jenny stepped forward. "He's not a weapon. We're not treating him like one," Warren replied evenly. "But you've seen the lab reports. This entity responds to stimuli. It forms neurological patterns. We're not just talking about a parasite anymore. We're talking about something capable of interfacing with the human brain. Something evolutionary. Or possibly extraterrestrial." Frank smirked. "That's a hell of a leap." "It's not a conclusion," she said. "It's a possibility. And possibilities like that don't walk free." Dr. Chen finally spoke. "There are ethical limits. He's a human being. And we intend to treat him as one," Warren said. "But national security comes first." Jenny crossed her arms. "What exactly are you proposing? Secure transfer to a DoD facility? Long-term containment, medical observation, and biological testing. No press, no leaks. His story stays buried." Frank's face hardened. "You want to disappear me?" "No, Mr. Murphy," she said calmly. "We want to protect you from what comes next. Because if this gets out, If the world learns that a living neural organism has been embedded in a U.S. soldier for 20 years, there won't be sympathy, there'll be panic and exploitation. You'll be poked, prodded, and paraded by whoever gets to you first. Frank looked at Jenny, then back at Warren. Sounds like you're just first in line. The silence that followed was cold and thick. Then Frank exhaled slowly. I'll go. Jenny's head snapped toward him. Frank, he raised a hand. Let me finish. He turned back to Warren. I'll cooperate. I'll go wherever you want. But, on one condition. Warren raised an eyebrow. You let Dr. Williams and Dr. Chen publish the findings. Not about me, about it. You let them name it, study it, prepare the world. You let Jenny release the truth when it's time. You don't bury this thing in a vault. You don't get to make the next soldier fight it blind. Warren was quiet for a long moment. That's not how this works, she said at last. Frank sat up straighter, the strength in his voice returning. Then I don't go. Warren looked to Chen, to Jenny, back to Frank, and finally she gave the smallest nod. You'll have a say, but from this point forward, everything you are, and everything you've become, is classified. Frank leaned back, his face unreadable. Haven't I always been? And 2 weeks later, the world shifted. In a quiet press release from a university medical journal, Dr. Patricia Williams described the discovery of a new class of neuroreactive invertebrate organism, likely introduced during overseas deployments, with potential implications for neurological study, memory retention, and immune modulation. There was no name, no photos, no mention of Frank Murphy. But the seeds were planted. Meanwhile, in a secure compound outside Langley, Virginia, Frank began the next phase of his life, surrounded by scientists, guarded by men with no names, and guided by a team that wanted to study the thing inside him more than they wanted to understand him. But Jenny visited when she could, and every time she did, Frank seemed a little more lucid, a little stronger. One afternoon she found him staring out across the compound garden. It doesn't talk to me anymore, he said quietly. The parasite? Yeah, it's quiet. Sleeping, maybe. Jenny nodded. Or listening. Frank turned to her. Do you think I made the right call? She paused, then said, I think the world will be safer because you did. He nodded, but his eyes stayed on the horizon. You know what I realized? He said. What? For 20 years I thought I was infected, broken, but maybe I was chosen. Not because I was strong, but because I was forgotten, because no one would notice if something else took root. Jenny looked at him, her voice softer than ever. But someone did notice. Eventually, he turned, offering a tired but real smile. Yeah, you did. And Frank Murphy became a name whispered quietly in military hospitals, veteran forums, and scientific circles too afraid to speak louder. He was never officially recognized again. Not in headlines, not in ceremonies, but among the forgotten. He became a myth, a man who carried something no one else could, a man who in silence gave the world a warning, and a chance to listen before it was too late.